What's up, everybody? My name is Estics, and if you're looking for a creepy crawlies commander, then I have the one for you. Fumulus, the Infestation, which is actually a mono black commander that focuses around sacrificing creatures. He says, whenever a player sacrifices a non-token creature, you get a 1/1 insect with flying. But not only that, this is also a tribal commander for insects, worms, slugs, and leeches, because whenever one of these creatures attacks, you gain 1 life. My only gripe with this commander is that if you're going to build a bug commander that is a vampire and a insect, why not make it like a mosquito or something? That's like the only thing. The rest of it is super cool, super awesome. Let's hop into it. Now, my biggest thing about building this commander is I kind of wanted to build a white weenies deck outside of white. It's actually now a insect weenies deck, I guess. That's stupid. Now, this deck is actually focused on attacking and getting life, and throughout the game, as you're attacking, you can actually sacrifice your creatures for value. And once you do that, you can actually become more and more of a threat on the board because you gain a larger board state. Now, on top of that, I want to be using creatures that also give you something from dying, so that you're not only getting something that just dies for no reason, but that you can also use as fodder for something else. And that's where I get the Scavengers. Now, these are the most important bugs in this deck, and these are going to gain you a lot of value from sacrificing creatures and just being bugs in general. Starting off with Devouring Swarm, which actually is just a placeholder for all creatures in this deck that are going to gain +1/+1 counters for other creatures dying. And this is just the one that I thought was the coolest. It has flying, but you also have things like Mortician Beetle that's really good, and there's a few others that I added into this deck because if things are going to die, why not add them? Go ahead and get that power in. It's a really good strategy if you wanted to go that route. And something that I think that is really good for this deck is a card like Endless Cockroaches. Endless Cockroaches is going to give you a ton of value because whenever it dies, it just goes right back into your hand. It actually doesn't cost that much mana, so you can actually just reoccur it in the same time so that you can get multiple triggers out of it, or you can just have it onto the battlefield as a blocker after you sacrifice it, which is actually going to give you a ton of value throughout the game. Now, Deadly Grub has Vanishing 3, and whenever it resolves, when it dies and it had no time counters on it, you get to create a larger 6/1 insect token. Now, from this token, you can actually just allow the grub to sit there and kind of like fester away on the field, acting as just a small little threat. But whenever it dies, you get a larger token, so reoccurring it later on is actually going to benefit you by just trading in a smaller creature for a larger value. Next, I have Drawshopper. Now, Drawshopper is actually not that great of a card itself, but it is a sack outlet if you need one. So whenever it says sacrifice a creature and Drawshopper gets flying, that really just gives you a flying creature, and it also allows you to sack your creature to get off something from your commanders. And I think Drawshopper is one of those cards that is situational, but the situation comes around a lot more often than you think, and it's a instant death trigger just in case. Next, I have Blight Beetle, which gives you protection from green, but also stunts the growth of your opponent's creatures, which is very important because these guys are kind of small and need a little bit of time to get going. So this is just going to throw a wrench in their whole plan. I think that's very important for this commander's abilities. Next, I'm moving on to the festering value of these cards, which are cards that allow you to sacrifice creatures and that get you value from these creatures dying. Starting off with Bellowing Mauler, which either drains each opponent for 4 or forces a sacrifice from each opponent's cards. Now, this is good because you can either just chip away at every single opponent that you have, or you get to chip away at their board state, which actually grows your board state as well. So that is value. So a really important card is Malevolent Awakening, which reads, 1 black, sacrifice a creature and return target creature from your graveyard to your hand, which is really good for something like Endless Cockroaches, because if you sacrifice Endless Cockroach to activate this card, you can now return a more important creature that is in your graveyard to your hand, allowing you to get value because the only thing you lose is Endless Cockroaches being on the battlefield, which is really good if you do it at the end step going into your turn. Next, I have Vampiric Rites, which gives you life and draws you a card and sacrifices a creature, which is all 3 of the primary activations for this deck. So everything that this deck wants to be doing is doing it in Vampiric Rites. And if you really wanted to stir up the board, you could play Priest of Forgotten God, which not only gives you a sweet outlet by sacrificing 2 creatures, but any number of opponents also lose 2 life and also have to sacrifice a creature. And if you're not playing anyone who is playing a tokens-based deck, you can get up to 5 activations from this alone. This is actually one of the best cards to have in this deck. Now, my next one is actually Melphic Scythe. Now, the reason I picked Melphic Scythe is because it allows you to actually attach it to a creature, and when that creature dies, you can then put a soul counter on it. Now, this soul counter is actually kind of important because it puts a 1/1 counter creature for each soul counter on this card. Now, that is so good for this deck because as you are sacking all of these creatures, you can make the next one even larger and even more of a threat so that your opponent is actually kind of forced to take care of it. This is the section that convinces you that all of your cards dying is no big deal because they will rise again. They will never die. This is a very important part of this deck. These are going to be cards that give you constant value and even have reoccursion printed onto them. So let me get into it real quick. Now, this is one of the cards that actually convinced me to build this deck, and it's Champion of Stray Souls. Now, the reason that this convinced me is because if you pay 3 and 2 black, tap it and sacrifice X creatures and return X creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, this is really good because you could basically just sack all of your creatures onto the battlefield, have them go into the graveyard, and then summon all of the ones that were in the graveyard beforehand and put them all back onto the battlefield. That triggers your commander as many times as you had as many creatures onto the battlefield, and then it basically cycles other creatures into the graveyard. That means that in the next turn, you could cycle those creatures back out of the graveyard and put them onto the battlefield, giving you the same value that it gave you the turn before, if not more. And that is a lot of mana, 5, but whenever you're doing shenanigans like this, you can basically sacrifice your tokens on top of it and get more creatures that were in the graveyard that you couldn't get out before. And then it has pay 5 and 2 black and put Champion of Stray Souls from your graveyard on top of the library, so it also reoccurs itself. I cannot believe this card is not played more. This is only 18 cents. Now, moving on to another card that is actually a win con for your commander, Bond of Agony. Now, Bond of Agony is really good because it allows you to pay life, which your commander should be getting you throughout the game, so you should be at least a little bit ahead of a lot of players, unless they're playing like something like White Health, which honestly, if you're playing right, you might be ahead of them too. But each opponent actually loses that much life. This is absolutely just a sucker punch. People won't see it coming. I think that it's very good. You get to do X amount of damage to everyone as long as you sacrifice all of your life. Now, my third card is Finality of Eternity. Now, Finality of Eternity is actually really good because it doubles as a removal, but if you pay up to 10, you are actually able to return all creature cards from the graveyard onto the battlefield, which is really good for people who have board wipes. It teaches them a lesson for being rude to you and basically allows you to really just blow up the entire field. Your creatures in your graveyard are going to be giving you by coming back on to the battlefield, and you can sacrifice them to give them even more value, which is really good. My fourth card is actually pretty fun and pretty simple, and it's Wiggling Grub. Whenever it dies, it actually gives you 2 token worms, which is actually pretty sick because it's a 1 for 2, and then if you can reoccur it pretty often, it actually makes it a really good combo piece for a lot of different creatures in this deck that want to sacrifice creatures for value. Now, the final recommendation of this video that is from our main deck that we are building right now is actually Wake the Dead. And the reason I chose Wake the Dead is because it does the same thing as Finality of Eternity, where it returns all creatures onto the battlefield. However, you have to sacrifice all creatures that were returned to the battlefield at the end of your end step. I'm going to go ahead and go on to the bonus section. So if you got a little bit of dough or are really serious about building the strongest part of this deck that you want to build, here are some cards that I recommend for you. Starting off with Phyrexian Obliterator. Now, a Phyrexian Obliterator, whenever it attacks, if you block it and you deal, like, let's say 3 damage, the blocking player actually has to sacrifice 3 permanents, which are usually going to be creatures first and then all of their supporting cards afterwards. So you are going to be gaining a lot of value by just attacking other people's creatures. My second card of this is Ajnan's Altar, which is honestly a really good card by just giving you mana for sacrificing a creature. So this is actually just something that gives you value for sacrificing creatures that you want to sacrifice anyway. And if you want to absolutely devastate your opponents and really just wreck their entire game plan, you could play Death Cloud, which makes each player lose X life, discard that many cards, sacrifice X creatures, and sacrifice that many lands, which is an everything wipe. I kind of hate this card. It does everything you want to do for the deck, and it honestly plays into the deck's kind of aesthetic feel. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. And if you want to build this deck, go ahead and check out my Moxie field down below. Only this many of you are subscribed. They could have changed after I edit this video. But if you guys want to support this channel, please let me know. And I have a couple other videos coming up. And if you want another bug commander, go ahead and check out this video. Thank you guys for watching, and happy castings.